Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. Human beings have come a long way since cave days in pretty much all respects of life, perhaps with one exception. People who can remember the 1970s or have seen pictures of people in the 1970s will notice one fairly significant difference to the world today. And that is there are far fewer people who are overweight or obese. So for most of human history, people managed to eat without being told by government what they should eat. And the results, again, if we contrast the 1970s to today, in the real world, are fairly self-evident. Human beings have been, for thousands of years, again till fairly recent times, hunter-gatherers. They could eat what they could hunt or catch or gather. Typically, they could gather a little bit more than they could catch. And this has, as I say, been the way for thousands of years. Commercial agriculture, which has been one of the drivers of improvement in human civilization, altered that. So most people now don't need to, if you like, catch or gather their own food other than going to the supermarket or the market. And that's good. We're not in any way suggesting that we want to go back to the days when we all had to grow our own foods, albeit, there's a lot to be said if people want to grow some veggies in the back garden or keep some chooks, again, whatever works for you. In the early 1980s, across the board, dietary guidelines, particularly the low-fat dietary guidelines, were introduced worldwide, and as a paper in the British Medical Journal published nearly a decade ago showed, there was no evidence, we've spoken about this on previous podcasts, for their introduction. And again, in the real world, as against in ivory tower academia or in government departments, in the real world, the results are very, very clear to see. You replace the sorts of foods that tend to fill people up, such as meat, fish, chicken, protein sources, and you replace it with refined carbohydrates. Again, people aren't as hungry, they eat more, the foods have higher calories. Again, the result is clear. So just when you thought things might not or could not get any worse, we now have the federal government, this is in Australia, advice on diet, and this will come from the NHMRC, which is the National Health and Medical Research Council, will now no longer necessarily just look at what it is good for human beings to eat, but will also incorporate climate issues. Now, before we go any further, yes, we need to look after the place, we should look after our own homes, we should look after the planet. That is absolutely the case. That is very, very different to saying that we should change our diets on the completely unvalidated and unproven notion that cows emitting, I'm trying to think how to put this politely so we don't get any knocks from any of our friends in the social media platforms, emissions from perhaps the tail end of the alimentary canal in cows, which contributes nothing to the temperature of the planet. Because, by the way, yes, it is methane gas, but if the grass wasn't eaten by the cows, the grass would decompose in due course and release some methane anyway. And there's a very interesting book written over a decade ago called The Vegetarian Myth that explains this. Now, once again, for people who want to be vegetarian, that's fine. That's your choice. People who want to be vegan, again, that's fine, that's your choice. There are 8 billion people on the planet. No one diet is going to suit all of those people, which is, once more, where the notion of dietary guidelines imposed by government assumes that every single person is going to want to and will be suited to eating the same foods. And evidently, this is not the case. But ultimately, if we are to have dietary guidelines, and personally I would get rid of them, but if we are to have them, they are about what is in the best interests of the health of human beings. And if people are particularly vegan, they will need B12 supplements, that's vitamin B12 and iron supplements. They will not get enough from their diet. Fine, we live in the modern era, you can do that. 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, it would have been a struggle. If people want to be vegetarian, again, that's fine. They may also need some supplementation. Why is supplementation needed? Because the diet is not going to provide sufficient quantities of a number of essential vitamins and minerals. The body cannot produce minerals, it cannot produce vitamins. Vitamins, vital amines. And the body is not a mine, so it doesn't produce minerals. So this changed apart from being fundamentally flawed, really reflects the ideological capture of a lot of these medical bodies. Interestingly, the health minister has sought to basically distance the government from this, and in typical terms has said, and I quote according to this headline in the Australian newspaper, "Trust the experts." Well, this assumes that the experts are actually just that and not just people with an opinion, and they're entitled to their opinion, but an opinion doesn't make you an expert, and it certainly doesn't mean that what you say, even if you happen to hold a job paid by the government, means you know any more or less than anybody else. You can have an opinion, that's fine, but it doesn't of itself confer any greatness upon you. In fact, there could be a view that says the exact opposite. Again, there is the push at the moment to get people to eat insects, and that's, if people want to eat insects, that's fine. And of course, we have fake meat, which is the worst of the worst. It is hyper-processed food. Anybody who wants to be vegetarian or vegan, eat vegetables. Don't eat meat, but certainly do not eat fake meat. The amount of processing, the amount of chemicals and additives and preservatives that goes into this frankenfood is absolutely not suitable for human consumption. So, stick to your knitting, as it were. But it really just shows that unfortunately, and it is sad in some respects, but a little bit like the story of either Chicken Little, who said the sky is falling, or the boy who cried wolf, ultimately, people's confidence in health authorities is falling. And as a member of the medical profession, this is quite sad, but ultimately if you give people information and in their own experience repeatedly they find it to be wrong, and enough people find it to be wrong, they're going to say, I'm being told this information, but I don't actually see that it works. Therefore, the next thing that you tell me also I'm going to have severe doubts about. And we're already seeing that with some small outbreaks in different places of measles, because people aren't getting vaccinated against measles. And by the way, the measles vaccination actually works, defined as you get it, you're highly, highly unlikely to either get or transmit measles. And as we know, there was a thing that people had to get a couple of years ago, I'm not going to mention it by name, again, for the reasons that we spoke about previously, that didn't stop you getting the other thing or transmitting it. And again, people see that. And, people in the real world will typically put two and two together much better than government, ministers and bureaucrats. So ultimately, what is the take-home out of this? Essentially ignore these types of government dietary guidelines. They're not based on science. They're not actually going to do anything to change the planet. If you want to look after the place and you're that way inclined, put some solar panels on your roof if that's your thing. Buy an EV if you can afford one and that's your thing. Eat more vegetables if that's what you want to do. But ultimately, there is no problem with eating red meat if that is part of your diet and you like a steak or a lamb chop. You're certainly not harming yourself. The idea that red meat is bad for you has also been totally discredited. In fact, the original notion was flawed, and that can be a subject of a whole other discussion. So not only was it flawed, obviously there's no basis to it, there ever was, so it can absolutely be quite safely ignored. If you don't want to eat meat, you don't have to take it up. Seriously, you don't if it's not your thing. But you can quite happily eat some steak or lamb chops or veal, whatever your thing is. Look, ideally, if you're in a position to and you can find grass-fed or you can find organic, good. We want to be looking after our animals. That, I think, is really important as best we can. And I think there are improvements that can be made, and consumer pressure can drive that. But in terms of your health, if you enjoy a steak or a lamb chop, as I said, or any other form of red meat, you can certainly continue to do that. And really, in terms of, in inverted commas, trust the experts, or in inverted commas, believe the science, until said experts and said science can demonstrate that it is worth trusting and believing, for now, I think you can pretty much be guided by what you find works for you and your body back in the real world. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.